Hello, let's talk about blood and its constituents. The human body contains 5 liters of blood, and within this blood, we have the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets suspended in it. And all these together form the blood plasma. Let's start with the red blood cells. The red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. The word erythrocytes means red cells. That's why we can refer to them as erythrocytes or red blood cells. The red color in the cells is due to a pigment known as hemoglobin. We all know that hemoglobin is a protein molecule with a globular structure. It is the one that brings in the red color in the cells. The main function of hemoglobin is to transport oxygen from lungs to the respiring tissues. That is the main function of hemoglobin. It reacts with oxygen in the lungs to form oxyhemoglobin, a form in which oxygen is transported within blood to the respiring tissues, where in presence of high concentrations of hydrogen ions, the oxygen is released. We shall discuss more about that. The red blood cells are first formed from the liver, that is during the early development of the embryo, or in the fetus stage, that is when the embryo is still inside the uterus. By the time a baby is born, the bone marrows take over the production of the red blood cells, and then the liver starts to perform other functions, implying that the bone marrow replaces the liver in terms of function, that is producing the red blood cells after birth. The bone marrow is contained within the humerus and then the femur, and then also the skull, the ribs, the pelvis, and other vertebrae start to function by producing the red blood cells. And this is done throughout lifetime. The red blood cells that are produced do not have a long lifespan. When the red blood cells are old, they rupture. The word rupture means breaking or splitting. And after splitting, it is the function of the spleen to remove the ruptured red blood cells inside the circulatory system. These ruptured red blood cells can be used to form other substances such as the bile pigment, which is also used as an alkaline fluid within the human body. The structure of red blood cells. The structure of red blood cells is unusual in several ways. That is, it is different from other structures of the cells that are contained within blood. Since the function of the red blood cells is to transport oxygen around the body, it is therefore important that the structure of the red blood cells itself is convenient or is well adapted to this function, and the function is of transporting blood around the body. One of the adaptations of the red blood cells is that the red blood cells are shaped like a biconcave disc. They are shaped like a biconcave disc. This descent or this biconcave disc is to increase the amount of surface area in relation to the volume of the cell. That is giving it a large surface area to volume ratio. Giving it a large surface area to volume ratio. The large surface area increases the rate of diffusion of oxygen in and out of the cells. It increases the rate of diffusion in and out of the cells. Therefore, this adaptation helps the red blood cells in releasing and obtaining oxygen. The oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells in the lungs, and it is going to efficiently diffuse out of the red blood cells in the respiring tissues. Another adaptation of the red blood cells is that they are small in size. This makes the hemoglobin molecules that are inside the cells to be close to the cell surface and therefore can quickly exchange the oxygen with the fluid outside the cells. If the hemoglobin molecules are far from the cell surface, then the rate of diffusion is also going to be slow because the diffusion distance increases. And the only way to make diffusion efficient, we must make sure that the hemoglobin molecules that are within the red blood cells are close to the surface so that there is exchange of oxygen inside the cells and outside the cells. Then the other function of the red blood cells being small is that it allows the red blood cells to squeeze through the capillaries. That is bringing oxygen close to the cells as possible when it is required. The capillaries have a small diameter, and if you can recall, we had said that the small diameter of capillaries is similar to that of the red blood cells, so that they can squeeze through and reach the cellular tissues where the exchange of oxygen can take place. Another adaptation of the red blood cells is that they are flexible. Being flexible. That is, they are able to deform so that they can pass through the narrower vessels. The narrower vessels, those are the capillaries that we are talking about. The red blood cells are able to change or alter their shape so that they can pass through these narrower vessels, availing the oxygen to the cells. This is possible because of the specialized cytoskeleton of the red blood cells, which is made up of a mesh-like network of protein fibers that allow the protein fibers to be stretched to different forms. Another adaptation of the red blood cells is that the red blood cells have no nucleus, mitochondria, and no endoplasmic reticulum. The lack of these organelles means that there is more room for hemoglobin molecules to occupy the red blood cells, making the amount of oxygen to be carried higher. If these organelles were contained within the red blood cells, this would reduce the space which could be occupied by hemoglobin, reducing the amount of oxygen to be carried by each red blood cells. So, in order to maximize the amount of oxygen which can be carried by each red blood cells, that's why They will not have a nucleus, they will not have the mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum. Remember, these organelles are reasonably larger and therefore can occupy a large space, and therefore they have to be removed. That is to do with the red blood cells. The white blood cells. White blood cells are sometimes known as leukocytes, which just means white cells. They are also made from the bone marrow. The white blood cells are easily distinguished from the red blood cells in a blood sample because one is that the white blood cells have a nucleus. They have a nucleus, and this distinguishes it from the red blood cells by having a shape that is different from the biconcave disc that is for the red blood cells. The shapes of the white blood cells are so many because of the different types of the white blood cells, which are going to be discussed later. The other difference in the white blood cells and the red blood cells is that most of the white blood cells are larger than the red blood cells. Although some are smaller, like the lymphocytes are smaller than the red blood cells, but most of the white blood cells are larger than the red blood cells. Another difference is that the white blood cells are either spherical or irregular in shape. They never look like biconcave. That is the other difference between the white blood cells and then the red blood cells. There are many different kinds of white blood cells with a wide variety of functions. Although all these are concerned with fighting against disease. The white blood cells are divided into two main groups. The white blood cells are divided into two main groups. We have the phagocytes and the lymphocytes. Those are the two major groups of white blood cells. Phagocytes are cells that destroy invading microorganisms by phagocytosis. This means that they surround or engulf the invading microorganisms. The commonest type of phagocytes that are always used are the neutrophils, and these can be recognized by a lobed nucleus and a granular cytoplasm. The other phagocytes we have are the monocytes, which are also used to engulf or to remove invading microorganisms. So, to summarize it all is that the phagocytes destroy microorganisms using phagocytosis, that is engulfing the invading organism, and then after which they destroy it. The lymphocytes, on the other hand, destroy microorganisms by secreting chemicals called antibodies. They secrete chemicals that attack the invading organisms, and we have called these chemicals antibodies. These chemicals attack and destroy the invading cells. Most of the lymphocytes are smaller than the phagocytes, and they have a large nucleus and a small amount of the cytoplasm. That's how you can differentiate lymphocytes from phagocytes. The differences between the lymphocytes and phagocytes can either be outlined in the way they attack the invading microorganisms or using their structures. For example, small amount of cytoplasm and a large nucleus, that is for the lymphocytes, and then the phagocytes can only be recognized using a lobed nucleus and a granular cytoplasm. There are different types of lymphocytes, and these types are discussed in chapter 11, that is to do with immunity.